first I want to say that being at this conference is like being back home in a way. I was telling Debussy yesterday that it's been 10 years since I went to Norway to my first animal rights gathering. And there I met a lot of you. I met Debussy, I met so many of you. I met Mia, I met Christo. So this talk today is really about the lessons we have learned as an organization and about connecting. So the first thing I want to do, in the spirit of this talk, is ask you to all stand up and please, as much as possible, find a person, please find a person that you haven't met at this conference, a new person, someone you don't know. Wait. Okay. And for 3 minutes each, I will mark the time. I want you to tell that person something you have learned during your life as an activist, or something you have learned during this conference. So, one person, another person, speaking for 3 minutes, what I've learned at this conference, or as an activist, and the other person, 3 minutes, what I've learned at this conference, or as an activist. Go!
Yeah.
Any volunteers to share? Anyone who wants to share? I'm up here, so if I can be up here, you can share your experience. Okay, we have someone over there. Peter.
David.
Sorry, I can't see from far away. Sorry, David, sorry.
Yes, so I work with 50/40 and we're building a great network working with NGOs from all areas, such as other environmental groups, for example, animal welfare, public health. And for me, cleaning stands a fair shot at reducing suffering to a large extent, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sort of pro that. I would say in a lot of ways. I don't think it's unproblematic. But here I'm from some of these groups and also from labor unions are actually speaking out against it. They're afraid that this very techy, very high-tech type of food production will just continue the food system as it is. Having a lot of power in the hands of few and ruining the food sovereignty further of developing nations, all that kind. And the first time I encountered that, I was like super annoying to hear. It's cheap.
Yeah.
But it makes sense that in a conglomeration or like a network we're building, our primary currency is consensus. So we want to actually bring some of those things into our way moving forward as well. So it was like a good humbling experience and like letting other perspectives in.
Excellent, excellent. Anyone else wants to share? Maybe one other person?
Yes.
Hey. Sorry, David, about that before. I know it's David Peterson, so I confused Peter with David.
Thank you, Peter.
Peterson, sorry. Not my day.
So the reason why I wanted to share is I really loved how I met with two other people and our lessons were completely different. So one person was talking about how we have to have compassion for people who eat animals and how we need to open ourselves up to make relationships.
Yeah.
The other person talked about how we can do anything we want with a team if our team is good. And then my feeling is that I've learned to really respect all tactics within the movement because I know that I've changed my opinions and now really see that we're all doing our best, and so that it's about building community as opposed to worrying about if you think that they're doing the best thing.
Yeah, awesome, thanks, Katie. So this exercise is aligned with the spirit of what I want to communicate here today, that we are a movement and that it's only learning from each other that we become stronger. So today I'm going to be speaking about animal equality. Raise your hands if you've heard about animal equality before. Okay, not too bad, not too bad. Its history and some of the important lessons that we have learned from our colleagues and from the work that you all do in Europe, with a stop on investigations, the very emotional part about arrests, and our transition to a farmed animal-only organization. Oops. I can't change slide for some reason. Andrea? So animal equality started in Spain in 2006, with a few activists engaging in different protests and civil disobedience. We had been involved in the movement for many years and wanted to use new tactics to bring awareness to animal abuse. We had no resources and very early on understood the importance of using the media to gain public awareness and attention. As Jan explained yesterday, our limitation of resources was huge, and it resulted in stretching our imagination to get as much media attention as we could. Our first action was a slaughterhouse chaining in Madrid. In 2007, inspired by our colleagues in Australia and Austria, we carried out our first open rescue, rescuing 6 baby piglets from a farm in Madrid. And in 2008, after one of our co-founders spent several days taking bus rides to visit slaughterhouses in the north of Spain, while he was taking care of these 6 baby piglets, we released our first investigation. The cost of this investigation was €100. As we understood the power of investigations, our work continued. We visited 172 farms in Spain, presenting one of the largest investigations ever presented in 2010. And as we reflect during this talk on the history of our organization and lessons learned, a key moment was our arrests. when they put in jail the heads of the movements in Spain. In 2012, we started working in other European countries, India and Mexico. And in 2015, we founded Animal Equality in the US. In 2016, we started our office in Brazil, as well as doing corporate outreach, releasing our first investigation in the US this year. Today, Animal Equality is working in 8 countries. We have a total of 90 employees globally, and now a significant budget to be able to carry out impactful programs. So I'm going to start with our investigations. Undercover Investigations are one of Animal Equality's most important programs. As an organization, we have conducted and presented over 100 investigations in 8 countries, having visited over 600 facilities. Our investigations have been key to corporate wins, educational programs, and change in legislation. And I want to show you this video as an example. There is graphic footage in the video.
Le informo, diputado presidente, 30 votos a favor, 6 abstenciones en contra, un total de 37 votos con 31 votos a favor.
Impacts 210 million animals a year. But Animal Equality's investigations didn't happen in isolation, of course. We were inspired and later learned directly from our colleagues, especially our colleagues in Europe. Perhaps some of the work that inspired us the most was the one done by the VGT in Austria, Network for Animal Freedom in Norway, and Katta Emile in Finland. I'm sorry if I didn't say that correctly. So back then, we were critical with what we called welfare reforms. And actually, one of the first gatherings I attended, we gave a talk against welfare reforms. This is true. We followed closely the Austrian campaign, which culminated in the passage of the Austrian Animal Welfare Act in 2004 and the ban of battery cage farming in Austria in 2006. The campaign carried out by our Austrian colleagues included direct action and the filming of conditions at battery farms across the country. We also, of course, followed closely what our colleagues in Norway and Finland were doing, who were investigating dozens of fur and pig farms and getting national media attention and debates in their countries. So our investigations were fueled by learning about what our colleagues were doing, attending international gatherings and events like this one here, and participating and supporting other groups doing investigations, who also participated in our investigations and supported us. I remember the first gathering I attended, I've talked about it a few times, in 2009. These meetings were so important to me, so important, that I literally went home, well, it wasn't home, it was a room in the school we were in, and tried to take as many notes as I could. I remember those conversations as if they happened yesterday. I remember speaking with one of my colleagues about how they had managed to get into farms praised by the industry. And I was like, my God, that is so clever. And what an impact that had had on their investigations. Jan also spoke about it yesterday. So as a culmination of all of this, in 2010, Animal Equality released its largest investigation to date in Spain. We visited 170 pig farms and released footage that created a national scandal around the way pigs were raised and killed in the country. For this investigation, we involved dozens of activists and volunteers that would come with us to farms at night. The funny thing is that of all of these dozens of activists, most of them are still involved in the movement. We held internal gatherings with all of our activists and colleagues, where we would experience what we had experienced at the international gatherings. We would teach people how to film, how to record, how to do a press conference. We all had to be good at everything because resources were so lacking. Seeing the examples of other organizations in Europe who had successfully done so, we brought journalists into farms, a strategy that we still use very well today. But just recently, we took a journalist into an Italian pig farm. The images not only shocked the journalist, but they went ahead and they wrote their own articles from their own perspective. And we, of course, follow the lead of our European colleagues and investigated farms that were praised by the industry. We followed a strategy that we had learned from our Finnish, Danish, and Norwegian colleagues. So first, with this investigation, we released the bulk of the investigation first. And when the industry came back and said, oh, you know, that's not what, this is just bad apples, rotten apples, we actually then released the footage of their own farms. There wasn't much that they could say then. In 2012, following and inspired by the work that some anti-vivisection groups were doing in the UK, we managed to get an undercover worker inside a pig farm in the UK. The undercover worker spent there several months, revealing footage of pigs being beaten and abused. This resulted in the prosecution of the farm workers, which was something that, as I'll explain, we weren't doing before. And it resulted in this investigation in the UK appearing on the BBC. I'm going to show you a clip.
Two farm workers who were secretly filmed beating and abusing pigs in their care have been told they could face jail. Jeffrey Towell and James Dove, who worked on a farm at Harling in Norfolk, have admitted causing unnecessary suffering to sows and piglets. You may find some of these pictures distressing.
It was here at Harling Farm where two workers were secretly filmed last year being cruel to pigs. They were recorded by an animal rights activist. This is what was filmed. The court was told that in one case a sow was clubbed 35 times and left to die, and that piglets would be picked up by their tails and thrown. First Jeffrey Towell, seen here in the white shirt, and James Dove in the dark suit, pleaded guilty at Norwich Magistrates Court to 6 and 4 charges respectively of causing unnecessary suffering to animals. The judge said that Towell had shown the highest level of animal cruelty, and although slightly less culpable, Dove had displayed a cavalier attitude in the way he handled the pigs. He added they both faced a real possibility of going to prison.
Clearly this is a very shocking and sensitive case in which Mr Towell and Mr Dove have let down the farming community. We're very pleased that they both pleaded guilty today and we await the decision of the judge.
The men will be sentenced next month. Marianne Missendale, BBC Look East, Norwich.
And we also learned from our European colleagues how to install hidden cameras in farms. And thanks to that, we managed to film the skinning of minks in Spain. And like this picture shows, the piles of chickens, some of them still being alive, discarded in a chicken farm. So as we continued to do investigations over the years, we kept learning. Here, I want to share with you today some of the most important lessons we have learned on investigations. You may not agree with all of them. This is just our humble opinion. So the first one is always press charges of any illegal activity on the facility, be it a violation of animal welfare acts, but also environmental laws or others. At the beginning, as a so-called abolitionist organization, we thought that pressing charges against farms was only focusing on the instances of cruelty. And what we wanted to do was question the entire industry. But we were the only ones to understand this. This was very difficult to understand for the media and resulted in very complicated press conferences and conversations where journalists and others would not understand why we would not use the legal frame. At the same time, not suing the farms resulted in similar media attention than if we had done it, because they focused on the instances of cruelty. Pressing charges against the farms resulted in more media attention. I remember a specific investigation that we did in 2011 into zoos in Spain. It was the first time we were pressing charges against zoos. I have never got so many calls from journalists. The second is that investigations are a tool. And as Jan said yesterday, they are one of the most important tools that we have for animals. But they can be used to maximize our overall strategy. So yes, investigations can be great educational tools to reduce meat consumption or promote veganism, but they can also be used to help influence companies towards corporate commitments. And as we saw in Mexico, they can change legislation. So think of investigations as part of your theory of change, not as a tactic in isolation. I would also recommend that you have a welfare ask with each release. So yes, an investigation of course can be educational and promote veganism, but it's also important to know what you're asking companies to do, as many of them will be calling you. When we think of investigations, and this is the last lesson, we think about getting footage of animal cruelty. But there are other tactics we can use. Perhaps investigating the environmental impact of a farm, investigate how the farm is damaging nearby communities. And here are some examples. So this is a drone investigation that we did in Catalonia, I'll say Catalonia, not Spain, that resulted in media coverage about the environmental impact of the pork industry. So what the title says is their film, the tremendous impact on the environment of pig farms. This was relatively cheap. Here we used a drone to film the largest religious sacrifice festival in the world in Nepal. The international outrage that was created and the work that we did with the government of India and Nepal resulted in a 70% reduction of the amount of large mammals that were killed at this festival in 2014. And of course, trying to be as innovative as possible and using 360. It is sometimes said that it's difficult to get investigations in the media. Well, that is not true in all of the countries, but it's definitely true in some. What we found is that doing this investigation with virtual reality got us into the most important newspaper in the world, the New York Times, as well as a media reach of 124 million with our iAnimal project. At this time, we are getting more views of iAnimal through the media than we could ever get with our headsets. Doing investigations in this new way also allowed us to go to college campus and get students interested in the technology. So they would watch iAnimal in their headsets, and most of them, we've calculated that up to 70 to 80% would then pledge to reduce their meat consumption or go vegetarian and vegan. And we presented our first iAnimal film at the Sundance Film Festival. I want to show you a video, again graphic, about the reaction to people to virtual reality. This is a telling.
My mom is a vegetarian, and now I just feel like I want to join her and not eat meat anymore.
As you can see, it impacted on me pretty profoundly. It's hard to kind of conceive how people still deny and wish to remain ignorant.
I mean, there's just something undeniable about being there, the animals, and yeah, it's really affecting. Undeniable.
We have also shared iAnimal with over 100 organizations worldwide that are using virtual reality as an educational tool themselves. You can also analyze the water close to lakes or rivers in farms to show the pollution it causes. This is a strategy that we've used recently in Italy. I want to go on to the second part of my talk. The second part of my talk focuses on repression and some of the lessons I experienced and I extracted from suffering it in my skin. Before our case of repression in Spain, there had been other important cases in Europe. After years of numerous milestones for animals in Austria through peaceful means, on May 2008, heavily armed force officers from an elite unit stormed 21 homes and the offices of a number of animal organizations. Breaking their way in, the masked police surrounded frightened civilians in their beds at gunpoint. After several months in prison, many of them on hunger strike, they were released. After 2 years waiting for a trial, they went to a trial in 2010. It was a grueling process that lasted a year. They were finally found not guilty of all charges. In the UK, there has been significant crackdown on animal activism for years, especially targeting activists that are doing anti-vivisection work, which includes arrests, prison time, house arrests, and many times their inability to work for animals. In June 2011, while I was driving to a slaughterhouse to film with another 2 activists, a police car stopped us. They asked us to exit the vehicle and read us a list of accusations that included belonging to a criminal organization, just like in Austria, revelation of secrets, and damages that amounted to several €100,000. All of these accusations added up to years in prison. Just like in Austria, all we had done was bring light to the cruelties of animals in fur farms. Heavily armed police forces entered our homes brutally. They took our computers, our drives, and other materials they kept for years, significantly impacting Animal Equality's ability to do work. Our income back then was a few €1,000 per year. They took with them years of our investigative material and drove us several hours in police vans to jails to the north of Spain, where we remained locked up for 5 days. During that time, we were in confinement and interrogated by the police. While this was happening, the judge investigating our case was on television saying we were guilty of these crimes. After some days in jail, some of us were released, but another 3 activists spent a month in prison, finally being released in August 2011. All of us with a list of serious charges that amounted to several years in prison over our heads. The case was all set up by the fur industry to stop us from doing investigations and revealing the cruelty inside farms. In an interview, the judge even said that he was related to a farm by his family. The case went on for years, with us understanding that our future mostly depended on how this would turn out. But with repression comes solidarity, and nothing was more important, and no bigger lesson was learned for all of us than the importance of solidarity in the movement. Activists from dozens of countries went out to protest demanding our release. My prison cell officer, true story, said he had people calling him and insulting him and demanding I have proper vegan food in 10 different languages. The solidarity continued beyond our release, with activists sending us money to pay for our lawyers, organizing potlucks, and supporting us publicly. The second biggest lesson was that conflict within the movement is generally not worth the time we spend on it. Animal Equality was arrested alongside activists from another organization we had problems with for years. But when you're in a prison cell for 5 days with no food because you're on hunger strike, you quickly know who your allies are. We also realized, even so more than before, that gaining public support is key. A lesson we learned again from our Austrian friends in Martin Ball, and how they managed their case after the release, seeing the incredible campaign they did. Even though we had been misrepresented in the media after our release, we started a campaign to gain as much media attention as possible and presenting as much footage and investigative work as we could. We also organized a Congress Against Repression, the first of its kind in Spain. And we invited judges, journalists, politicians, and other important social actors like Greenpeace, Amnesty International, to talk about repression and take a stand on our case. In 2014, the case was closed, with the judge determining that the work we did was of public interest. And not only were we not criminals, but the Spanish population had the right to know what was happening in farms and slaughterhouses. I'm going to move on to the last part of my talk about effective altruism. Our arrests made us rethink some of the strategies and think of ways in which we could increase our impact and craft messages that would have even bigger public support. At the same time, the effective altruist movement was kicking off. Effective altruism, as a lot of you probably know, is the idea that we should use evidence and reason to determine the most effective ways to benefit others. Effective altruism encourages us to consider all causes of action and act in ways that bring about the most good. Activists from around the world influenced us in becoming an effective altruist organization, but so did the discussions with our European colleagues. And I don't think this can be underestimated. Perhaps some of the most important conversations for me happened at the Animal Rights Gathering in Poland in 2012, organized by that wonderful woman over there, the Brucia. Been around sometime. Where several panels and discussions were held about messaging and impact. The beauty of these gatherings, of the gathering we're here today, can't be underestimated. This is where change is made. A few years later, activists such as Tobias Leonard were speaking about how to create change in conferences, helping us rethink our strategies. And organizations such as VIBU joined those conversations. At Animal Equality, we started our journey to become a more effective organization by carrying out several leafletting studies about messaging in Spain and the UK. The studies, of course, weren't perfect, but indicated that leafletting had an impact. And this was the first time, bulb, perhaps, in the dark, where we had some evidence about the work we were doing. Incorporating effective altruist principles also resulted in Animal Equality developing a strategy plan, which also resulted in the organization deciding to focus on farmed animals. During our history, we had a big focus on farmed animals, with most of our investigations, as you've seen, being on farmed animals. We also did work into zoos, entertainment, and circuses, all very important work. But following the effective altruist principles of scale, neglectedness, and trackability, we could see how the suffering caused to farmed animals accounts for the largest amount of human-caused suffering. Now, this is important, human-caused suffering, because most animal suffering happens in the wild as well. With 56 billion land animals killed every year, these animals have the most terrible of lives, not having the most basic protections. They can't even move around. And as we know, there are few organizations focusing on farmed animals. I want to show you a part of a video that I found really inspiring to understand the concept of effective altruism. Does anyone know who this is? Maybe not?
Many people will think, though, that charities aren't really all that effective. So let's talk about effectiveness. Toby Ord is very concerned about this, and he's calculated that some charities are hundreds or even thousands of times more effective than others. So it's very important to find the effective ones. Take, for example, providing a guide dog for a blind person. That's a good thing to do, right? All right, it is a good thing to do. But you have to think what else you could do with the resources. It costs about $40,000 to train a guide dog and train the recipient so that the guide dog can be an effective help to a blind person. It costs somewhere between $20 and $50 to cure a blind person in a developing country if they have trachoma. So you do the sums and you get something like that. You could provide one guide dog for one blind American, or you could cure between 400 and 2,000 people of blindness. I think it's clear what's the better thing to do.
And I want to move on to the next slide so we can look at this graphic and think about what Peter Singer just said. As we know, there is a vast difference between the amount of farmed animals who are used and killed versus the funding that they get. As part of that strategic analysis and focus on effectiveness, we also decided to focus more on institutional versus individual change. So changing institutions rather than educating individuals. Changing people's habits is an important, very important, but it's a monumental task. And at Animal Equality, we want to ensure that we are spending the same amount of resources in changing the institutions these people inhabit. Some of the most advanced research in habit change, such as the recent book Atomic Habits by James Clear, actually stresses the need to change environment in order to change habits. I highly recommend you read this book. If not, there's a wonderful interview to James Clear on the podcast 10% Happy where he goes over the book. This means that people behave in ways that are aligned with the environments they live in. So let's take smoking, for example. If an environment is really conducive to smoking, we know this, people will tend to smoke more than in a heavily taxed and prohibitive environment. So what is this environment we're trying to change? Well, we work to change laws, as we saw in Mexico, to make cruel animal practices illegal. We work with companies to ban cages and some of the other cruelest practices, and to also reduce the amount of animal products in their supply chain. This also helps make animal products more expensive and plant-based options more accessible and available, as well as directly impacting the lives of the millions of animals whose suffering is reduced thanks to these reforms. As we see in the countries with the strongest animal welfare laws, also tend to be the countries that have the most vegetarians and vegans. We also know, thanks to studies such as the Kansas study, that media attention to animal welfare has negative effects on the demand of meat. And institutional campaigns are also traceable, trackable, which is another key effective altruist point. Massachusetts passed in 2016 a ban on cages in the entire state of Massachusetts and a ban on the importation of any product that comes from an animal into a cage into the state. And we know when when implemented, this will affect 7 million animals. And a study came out recently by Rethink Charity that estimated that corporate campaigns impact 7 to 120 chickens per dollar. The last stop in this talk will be how Animal Equality is building to be a more professional organization. We started out the talk showing how a bunch of activists got a lot of media attention. And all of these tactics are still very important. But probably what is mostly going to determine the success of a project is if that project is operational and stable financially. I would also add that it's very important for organizations to build their reputation. Some recommendations I can give is ensuring that your project or your organization has a strategy plan, yearly objectives, and a systematic way of looking into operations and data. We're working on it. Also ensuring that we are finding ways in which the organization is stable economically and legally protected. I'm happy to go into more details if anyone has questions after the talk. So what does the future look like for us? As we continue to grow, we want to continue investing in corporate and legislative change. Of course, we also want to expand to the regions in the world where we will have the biggest impact. As we can see in this graphic, half of the pigs of the world are in China, and 60% of the farmed fish are in China. And as an effective altruist organization, we cannot forget the animals and the numbers. And the animals that die, the farmed animals that die, and the largest number are fish. So I have been in this movement for over 18 years, and even with the difficulties, there are two things that keep me going. Firstly, of course, it's the animals. I visited a chicken farm a few weeks ago, and the suffering I saw shook me to my core again. Having the victims present, the absolute neglect and abuse they suffer must keep us focused and resilient. But also the importance of sharing and movement building. The people I've met, the connections I've made, the friends I've made, the lessons I've learned. There's a phrase I love. It says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And animals need us to go as far as we can. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I guess now is the time for the questions.
Yes.
So it's not really a question. I just wanted to thank Animal Equality for their work, because I believe that among all the successes that you achieved, one of them was actually also inspiring our work. And I also went to this gathering in 2009, and I remember that I was extremely inspired by the work of Animal Equality at that time. So I kind of feel that probably without your work back then, we might not even think about doing activism in Poland as well. So, you know, in this way, inspiration kind of spreads. But for me personally, I also feel that Sharon was an extremely important person, because it was a real role model of a female leader at that time. And in a movement that's really like full of great women, actually having women leaders is still rare, and it was even rarer like 7, 8 or 10 years ago. So I personally don't know if I would manage to become the president of the organization without seeing the example of Sharon, who was one of those, don't know the right word, but you know what I mean.
Thank you so much, Zarusia. The admiration, the absolute admiration and respect is you're one of the people I admire the most. What you've done, the organization you've built, and your strength, resilience, and power are inspiring to us all. So I'm humbled that you would say that.
I'll just add that I think we'll even have birthday on the same day.
Yeah, thanks for the very inspiring talk. You mentioned that you used to be kind of abolitionist, that you were against pressing charges against welfare demands. I would be interested, what exactly was it that changed, and what arguments convinced you back then?
Great question, great question. So I think for me personally, I was talking to someone about it the other week. For me personally, I think that I was never convinced about this abolitionist. I was very outspoken about it, but I was never fully convinced. I was like, I don't know. But I've never voiced it. And then the arrests happened, and I think for all of us, we had to take a step back. Very importantly, because we were in jail and they'd taken all of our stuff. So when we got out of jail, we were like, okay, well, we have to think about things. We weren't just caught up in the urgency and the immediacy. And at the same time, there was a lot of discussions within the movement about strategy. I remember this gathering that was in Italy in 2010. And I remember that there was beginning to be some conversation. I remember actually we presented this 172 pig farm investigation, and we said, well, we didn't sue the farms. I remember Martin Baluch did what? So that was definitely something that stuck in my mind. And then after, there was also another investigation that we presented, and there was a press conference. And I remember the journalist was like, what? You're not presenting charges. So there was all of that mixed in with the repression. The conversations about effectiveness were beginning. And I think that the most convincing thing, I just think, it was being able to help animals more, impact, just knowing and seeing when we presented this zoo investigation in 2011, just how much further we were getting with our media coverage. It just seems to me very evident. And then after that, we became, then of course, you start reading more about it, et cetera, and that's how it evolved. Did I answer your question? Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for that very inspiring talk, by the way. I was wondering, what did actually change in your strategic after the arrest? Because it seems like you're still making investigations, and I find it hard to see what is different.
Good question. So first,
sorry, really, really cool that you got through them.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So the first thing was the pressing charges. So that was something that we weren't doing before. So we started doing that because it was very clear to us that this was not about our purity. This was about I don't want to use this word, but like a conflict with the industry, right? And that we were like holding back all of these tactics, and they were using all of their tactics against us. So that was the first thing. The arrests, and then we're war people. We have to make sure that we're using all of the tactics in our toolbox, always nonviolent and within legality, of course. And then another thing that it sparked was the creation of, years later, but the creation of a strategy plan, and I would say eventually the focus on farmed animals, because there was some reflection about the time we had on this planet and how we wanted to use that time. When you see yourself in such a situation where you can see the end of your activism, you kind of become more reflective about what you're doing. So it also kind of precipitated us creating a strategy plan and focusing on farm animals. Not immediately, but in the long term. And also the last thing is public support. So we've always been an organization that engaged public support. We always did things that most of the public would agree with. But it was very, very clear for us that we had to focus on that even more if we wanted to be more effective and fight repression more effectively. So some of our messaging, I think that also prompted some of our vegan messaging to change into meat reduction messaging. Again, not immediately, but with time.
Thank you very much.
Great question, thank you.
Hi, I first have to unfortunately correct Peter Zinger there. I challenged him on the claim that...
You do it.
No, I challenged him publicly some years ago on the claim that it costs $20 to $50 to cure blindness. There are many complications with that, but it's probably much more currently, according to like Charity Alter Give Well, probably the most promising way to cure blindness costs like $1,000 per visual impairment reversed. Also, but there is a sense in which that is correct. I think it doesn't take into account all the costs, then it's maybe $100. It's in general, the difference between charities are not as big as effective altruism movements kind of emphasized in the very beginning. Also, I was happy to hear you cited my estimate of corporate campaigns. But,
thanks for that.
But yeah, you said it impacts 9 to 120 chickens per dollar spent, but it's actually years. And if you want the number of chickens, it's 10 to 280.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I am from Hong Kong and I'm actually here with a few friends. So I'm really glad that you brought up China. So I was just wondering, and it's just been 2 days for me here, but I really see that a lot of people are interested in empowering the movement and people in Asia as well. So I was wondering if you have any plans to support local activists and organizations in Asia. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So what we're doing now is, as part of our objectives for 2019, we're coming up with several reports on China and other regions. So based on those reports, we'll be making strategic decisions about when and how we will start working in China. Of course, it also will depend on the amount of resources that we have. But yes, absolutely. Our way of looking at it is we want to be as effective as possible, and probably one of the most effective things we can do is work with organizations that already exist and empower them to do more work. So yes, absolutely. And I'd love to touch base after the talk if you have time. Thank you for the question.
I've got a similar question. So you talked about the history, which was very impressive and inspiring. And what changes and main focuses do you want to see in the next 5 and 10 years in the movement?
Wow, what a big question. Wow. I think that we've come very far as a movement. Just thinking of kind of those three kind of areas that I touched on. I think yes, as a movement, the countries where there is more resources should be thinking about dedicating those resources more to countries where there's less resources, but at the same time, there is a huge amount of farmed animals. I also think it's very important for the movements to get new resources. I think that we're very, very far away than where we were in 2006 when we started animal equality and we were doing investigations with bus rides and $100, but we're still severely underfunded as a movement. So we have to think of ways where we can get more money for our organizations, for the activists to continue building the grassroots movement, but also to send resources to countries that need them. I think that the best next big discussion will be around, especially for that coalition of organizations that are working on hens and chickens, will be fish, and that's definitely going to be very challenging, but discussions that I think we should start having now. And finally, as I said in my talk, this is a very controversial topic, but most of the suffering occurs in the wild. It's not human caused. So we have to start having those discussions within the movement and thinking about what are approaches that we can take, if any. Maybe we don't have to take any approach, but we need to start having discussions about that.
So just to you would say to more resources for integrated activism, or what do you think about like the big actions DXE has done now?
I think DXE has an important message. I think that some of the tactics that they use are definitely very innovative. I would question some of just because I've been a victim of repression myself and I know what can spark repression in states and countries, especially in a country like the United States, I would probably think that there is some further, I say this humbly, for conversations about what the implementation of these tactics is going to mean long-term for them in terms of prison sentences, but also on cracking down on the movement. I think that those are very important conversations that we need to have also. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So the announcement, once again, the group photo will be taken at 5 p.m. 10 minutes after 5 p.m. In the garden, and follow this lady if you want to be in the photo. And thank you very much for your time.